Welcome to the Prophecy Club. We are going to do a series because I think it's important that we all understand that these hurricanes, while they probably are the hand of God, they probably are the judgment. As you recall, Dimitri was told that God is going to send all kinds of hurricanes and floods and storms to weaken us, to show us his hand. Okay, so okay, I understand. They probably are the judgment of God. But we also have to understand that the hand that God might be using to bring that judgment may very well be the hand of the Russians. Again, I can't guarantee it's them, using scalar wave. And I can't guarantee it's scalar wave. However, I want us all to understand what scalar wave can do. So here's what we're doing. I'm going to be playing the audio of two of what I consider to be the best, most informative DVDs out there anyplace, specifically talking about scalar wave. Now, the first one is called Russia's Secret Weapons to Defeat America by Bill Schneblin. Let me briefly tell you about this. Bill reveals technology that the Russians have that can knock out anything on the land, on the sea, under the sea, any place on the globe with little to no trace of it. It can make large areas of the atmosphere super hot, as in tornadoes, hurricanes, or super cold, as in snow and ice storms. And the other one is Weapons of the New World Order by Nick Begich. This one also discusses the same thing with additional information on HAARP, also how it's used in military applications, and how it can also be used to basically put an umbrella over the entire nation of Russia and any of our planes or our missiles that we might throw at Russia. It could defeat them all, like big umbrella over the whole nation. Each DVD is valued at $30. This week, we're making both of them available in the Scalar Wave gift offer for a gift of just $30. Both DVDs for a gift of $30. prophecyclub.com or 785-266-1112. The Scalar Wave gift offer. Now let's go listen to Russia's Secret Weapon to Defeat America by Bill Schneblin.
End of the Dead Sea. He said, son, you must warn this nation.
And now your host for the Prophecy Club, Stan Johnson.
Welcome to the Prophecy Club, where we study and research Bible prophecy. The topic of tonight's talk is Weapons of the New World Order. Our speaker is an international speaker and author, and he's going to give you an update on HAARP, spelled H-A-A-R-P, the HAARP Project. He's going to be talking about the dysfunction of our military, weapons of the New World Order, things like radio frequency radiation, electromagnetic pulse, extremely low frequency, lasers, chemicals, weather control, militarization of all law enforcement, and new technologies that will eliminate what little privacy we have left. Will you help me welcome Dr. Nick Begich?
Thank you all for being here, and I'll give you a little bit additional background on myself and sort of how I got involved in these issues. And then we'll talk about an update on the HAARP issues and then kind of go from there with the latest material that we've developed. My father was a state senator and later a United States congressman. I have a doctorate in traditional and complementary medicines. My area of interest in that field was electrophysiology, which is the effect of electromagnetic fields on the human body, which is what attracted me to these issues to begin with. Because we're really talking about new technologies, a variety of technologies that people need to be aware of, that really are the new direction in which wars will be fought in the future. Some of that we've even seen in the most recent conflicts. But let's talk a little bit about the HAARP Project and sort of where that is and what that is for those that may not have heard about it. HAARP is the High Frequency Active Auroral Research Project, which is a joint project of the United States Air Force and Navy. It operates in Alaska. And when I first ran into this, it was in a very short article, 5-column-inch article, dealing with that issue, and it was in an Australian journal. Now, I live in Alaska, which is a vast region, but at the same time, it's a very small population. We have only 600,000 people in Alaska, so you tend to be on top of issues that are happening around you. My family's very political, which even makes it more so. We tend to stay on top of what's happening within our region. And reading about the HAARP Project, the first thing that struck me is it seemed quite unbelievable. The technology that was being expressed in that article, what it was being asserted to be able to do. Quite frankly, I didn't believe it when I first read it. But my habit is when you read something that's really startling as you go and you check it out and see what's really there. And we're very fortunate in my part of the world, in Anchorage, Alaska, we have one of the federal depositories for federal records, which means that our community library has to produce any federal document that isn't classified if somebody wants it. So it's kind of a nice resource for a researcher when you can go in and ask for virtually anything and they've got to produce it. Now, if it's not there on microfilm, they round it up for us and move it into the library so we can see that material. And there's actually, I think, a little over 70 of those libraries around the country, so they're not very, very common. Likewise, we have extensive microfilm files, and one of those sets of microfilms were the U.S. patents, which were the first place that I went to look, because this technology was asserting a lot of different things, and it was built around what at least appeared in that first article, 3 patents. What we found is there were actually 9 patents surrounding the technology. There were a number of government documents that were public documents, the documents that led to the contract to build the facility, as well as the environmental impact statements, which are required on all major projects. Now, what did that first article say that was so startling? First of all, they were talking about one instrument, the HAARP instrument, and this is a radio frequency transmitter. And it's most of the time when you think of radio frequency energy, you think of energy coming off of a transmitter and dissipating very rapidly the further that you get away from the transmitter itself. That's why when you get away from radio stations, the signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker until eventually it disappears. With HAARP, they had figured out a way to focus that radio frequency energy, to concentrate it into a relatively small area. And they do this by using a field of antennas. And this field of antennas are fired in a very specific way. And what that causes is the radio frequency energy to go into what's called cyclotron resonance, which can be pictured as sort of a corkscrewing motion that focuses the energy and moves it high up above the atmosphere into an area called the ionosphere. Now, the ionosphere starts about 30 miles above the Earth's surface. It extends for several hundred miles out from there. This is what's responsible for shortwave broadcasts, for instance, being able to be heard around the world, because it skips off of that. It bounces the signal off of the ionosphere. It's very important for communications, both civilian and military, which is one of the reasons the military really wanted to study the ionosphere, to figure out, for instance, right now we're in a solar cycle that disturbs the ionosphere from time to time and causes our communications to not work the way they're supposed to. Radio stations go out, or telecommunication systems don't work smoothly. So the more that we learn about the ionosphere, the more efficient we can manage our communications, as well as if we could ever figure out, and this is what the meat of HAARP is about, how to manipulate the ionosphere to create the ideal circumstance to make sure we can carry our communication. That became a compelling interest to the military. At the same time, being able to disturb the ionosphere in a way that would deny, say, our adversaries the ability to communicate. So that was the first major area the military had an interest in terms of the HAARP instrument, because here was an instrument that on the ground could focus a tremendous amount of energy up, and then by manipulating that energy, controlling it in very specific ways, a number of weapon effects are possible. And I'm just going to kind of go through some of those quickly because I really want to get on to the new material. But first of all, the first thing was communications. Disrupting communications and carrying our own was one of the big objectives. Along that line, one of the things that was important was the idea of being able to utilize this system for communicating with submarines when they're deep under the oceans. Now, high-frequency signals cannot pass through the ground or the sea very far, so you can't communicate under most communication modes to submarines. So what they use is in Michigan and Wisconsin and on the Aleutian Chain and a number of other places around the world, they have 14 to 26 mile long antennas that are buried under the ground that create a signal called an ELF, an extremely low frequency signal. This is a long wave that penetrates the earth and sea and can be used for communication with a submarine. Now with HAARP, instead of having antennas buried under the ground, by pulsing the signal, vibrating that signal, modulating that signal, this high-frequency signal, they can actually cause the ionosphere to begin to vibrate in sympathy. And what that does is convert up to a 1,000-mile long portion of the ionosphere into a broadcast antenna that sends an extremely low frequency signal back through the earth and sea. So they actually convert something that God created to do one thing. They convert it from essentially DC current to AC, alternating pulsing current. This then acts as an antenna, sends that energy down, and they can use it for communications. Now, one of the other things that the military uses this same mode of operations for, in fact, in 1996, it's what the Congress appropriated the money for. They said you can't have any more money unless you prove that you can use this technology for one of their claims, which was called earth-penetrating tomography. In very simple language, what that means in the vernacular would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth several kilometers deep. And this was right after the Gulf War, and everybody's running around looking for the underground nuclear facilities and the chemical and biological plants that we suspected were in Iraq. So this became the priority for the Senate. They wanted to see whether or not this technology could really be used in that way. As a result, they tested that application. They proved that it could work effectively, and they got their money for that year and subsequent years. And it was actually funded under non-proliferation and counter-proliferation of the defense budget in that year. Now, another application along the same line is creating what's called an ELF, extremely low frequency signal. I'm going to get back to that concept as we go on tonight, because there's some other side effects to that we're going to need to discuss. So we've got communications, and we've got earth-penetrating tomography, or X-raying the Earth in the vernacular. The next thing that comes out with this technology is its over-the-horizon radar capability. Now, when you think of the Earth, the curvature of the Earth, standard radars were essentially line of sight. They figured out a way to look around the actual curvature of the Earth for incoming objects. Now, the old technology, as objects came close in, they became highly distorted because the technology wasn't sophisticated enough.
We'll be right back after this message. Well, the truth is almost no people on earth agree on all points of the Bible. But if you listen to the Prophecy Club, the Spirit of Prophecy Church might be just right for you. Our two most controversial beliefs are speaking in tongues and post-trib. But you might have to attend a long time to see anybody speaking in tongues, and we don't really make post-trib a big deal. But our two only sticking points are Jesus is Lord and the King James Bible. So if you're not attending a church, or if you're maybe looking for a new or a different church home, especially if you like to listen to the Prophecy Club, Spirit of Prophecy Church might be a fit. Most of our congregation found us via Prophecy Club, and many actually drive long distances to attend. We suggest you visit at least 5 times before making your decision. And if you walk in Sunday morning about 10:15, you walk into coffee and donuts. You're free to leave anytime, no questions asked. So, if you listen to Prophecy Club, give us a try. Spirit of Prophecy Church, 2540 K Avenue in Plano. That's on the corner of Park and K, like the margarine, right behind the Whataburger. Spirit of Prophecy Church, 2540 K Avenue, Plano, Sunday, 10:15. Ask for Stan. The number one killer in most emergency events, surprisingly, is drinking contaminated water. Being able to scoop water out of the puddle and filter it may save your life. I drink all of my water filtered through a Crown Berkey. Now, it's a gravity filter filtering down to virus levels. Contaminated water in the top gives you drinking water out the bottom. It's what the missionaries use. There are 7 Berkey options from 1 to 8 filters. Order them at prophecyclub.com. Be sure and order 2 to 4 extra black filters as backup. That's prophecyclub.com or 785-266-1112. Berkey water filters. And now, back to the program.
As objects came close in, they became highly distorted because the technology wasn't sophisticated enough to keep that distortion from occurring. At the same time, you could pick up things from a very high elevation, but things like a cruise missile wouldn't show up on the old over-the-horizon radar technology. With HAARP, you see everything from ionospheric levels, which is where intercontinental ballistics missiles carrying nuclear warheads would be coming in from, all the way down to cruise missile heights. So essentially you see everything. You don't get distortion coming close in, and you can see around the curvature of the Earth. So over-the-horizon radar. Now taking that to the next step, when you create the energy field that allows you the over-the-horizon radar capability, if you increase the power slightly, every object coming in has a signature, an energy signature around it. Now, with satellite-based technologies, and there's a patent dealing with this in this cluster of patents, you can actually deduce which of those incoming objects are carrying nuclear payloads. Because when they carry nuclear payloads, they have a very unique signature, an electromagnetic signature that shows up. Now, given that, the way they always envisioned a nuclear attack was a threat cloud would come in, and this would mean that you'd have as many as 100,000 incoming objects. And the idea was that a few hundred or maybe 1,000 would carry nuclear payloads. And the idea was you overwhelm your enemy so that they target everything and some of them get through. And this was the whole idea around having way more missiles than we needed to destroy the Earth. I don't know how many times before they started to disarm some of them, but also to overwhelm with decoys so that you could always be able to get some through. But if you can figure out where the real threat is, I mean, granted, the ones that are not nuclear armed still create damage, but if you could take out those with nuclear payloads, you reduce the amount of damage that would take place on U.S. soil. Going the next step, if you increase the energy even more in this over-the-horizon mode, you can create what's called an electromagnetic pulse. Now, this is a surge of energy that allows for the interference with the avionics, the things that control the flight path, the onboard computers controlling these sophisticated missiles, causes them to malfunction, and the crafts crash. Now, electromagnetic pulse was first discovered, and some will remember this, back when they were doing the atomic tests in the South Pacific, and they had blasted one off of the ocean quite a distance up from the ground. But what it did is it created this surge of energy that knocked out power in Hawaii for a couple hours. And this was back in 1962, 63, right around in that time frame. And the government started looking at that and saying, if we could create a surge of energy, maybe without atomics or nuclear blasts, maybe we can use this to disrupt communication. And many will remember hearing the warning that if we ever had a nuclear attack and just one went off far enough up above the United States, it would knock out all the electronics across the country, everything from toaster ovens to sophisticated computers. And that's what they were talking about, this electromagnetic pulse capability. But now with this instrument, you have the ability to artificially create it without the nuclear fallout, which is quite advantageous from a military perspective. At the same time, some other things came up with HAARP, the idea of transferring energy from one point on the planet to another. In other words, focusing this radio frequency energy up into the ionosphere, bouncing it off of reflectors, and then reconfiguring it on some other part of the planet into electrical energy. Because what you have is essentially, to get from A to B, you get natural gas or some fuel source that converts to electricity, converts to radio frequency, goes through the antenna array, bounces off, comes back as radio frequency, and then gets converted back into electrical energy. Now, they believe that that idea actually is economic around 2004 for some parts of the world that don't have ready supplies of energy. But in a battle situation where you need a lot of energy and the battlefield environment, you can see what the interest would be. Now, the problem with that one is, any of you ever done any carpentry work, you know that if you're got a 40-foot room across and you get a 1/16 of an inch out at one end, you start getting several inches out on the other. Well, figure that out in terms of something on the ground and something many, many miles above the Earth's surface. If you're slightly out, or you get a solar wind that knocks the reflector slightly out, you've got this blast of energy running through your neighborhood instead of where it's intended to go. So that's a bit of a problem, and one that I don't think can easily be overcome, but nonetheless, it was one of the things within this cluster of patents. Now, Dr. Bernard Eastland was the inventor of the primary patents dealing with this technology. He was also the person that put together the original teams for this project. And Dr. Eastland had a couple of other ideas. One of them is that using the same array, you could actually change the chemical composition of the upper atmosphere by creating chemical reactions using this instrument. For instance, he suggested you'd be able to increase ozone, increase the ozone available in the ozone layer as an example, or knock out specific pollutants in the upper atmosphere. which from my perspective, as a matter of, of national interest, it certainly would seem that that would be one, if the story is true about ozone depletion being this big villain, we would certainly want to see develop. But unfortunately, that is not on the planning blocks for the military, although it is in the original patents. One of the other things Dr. Easton pointed out was the idea that this instrument might be used for weather modification, actually changing weather patterns over a large geographic area. Now, since our original work was published, an additional paper was prepared by Dr. Easton for the European Space Agency, which is the European equivalent to NASA. Now, that paper was to look at a HAARP-type instrument specifically for manipulating weather patterns. And he completed that work. They actually modeled this concept at the University of Oklahoma. And it's interesting, when they modeled it at the University of Oklahoma, do you remember a few years ago when the tornadoes whipped through that area? Created huge damage, and then President Clinton showed up on the scene, and one of the things he said at the University of Oklahoma was, "Don't worry, we're going to figure out a way to depress the energy in these tornadoes." And everyone kind of laughed it off. Well, 2 months before is when Bernard Easton finished his modeling to do exactly that, and that was done for the European Space Agency. In fact, it was a very well-received paper, and he's got a follow-on contract that just came in on that project. The idea that you can use this system for that kind of activity, for some people will say, well, wouldn't that be great to be able to knock out a tornado threatening a city? The problem is the energy has to go somewhere. It just doesn't disappear. Energy has to go somewhere. And the problem is you can't adequately model where that energy is going. And this is one of the big problems. When you think about ways in which HAARP can be used for weather modification, let me give you a couple of examples. One of them is when you, let me go back a little bit. The earlier versions of the HAARP instruments were called by the military ionospheric heaters, because they could heat up a portion of the ionosphere. And in so doing, an area, for instance, above HAARP can be heated about 30 miles in diameter. It then lifts up, because it's heated, it lifts up, and it can lift up, instead of being 30 miles above the Earth's surface, they can push it out to be a couple hundred miles above the Earth's surface within that area. All that lower atmosphere then moves in to fill that empty space. And when it does, it alters the pressure systems below. If there's a jet stream in the neighborhood, it has a tremendous impact on where that jet stream is going to go. In other words, it changes within our region of Alaska, over a very large area, a tremendous amount of weather. Now, what does that mean for the rest of the country? Well, if you watch the 6 o'clock news, you realize that a lot of weather originates in Alaska, having a profound effect on Canada and the United States. And what we know from our observations of El Nino and El Nina, that when you have weather, and those are big anomalies, those are huge anomalies, but when you have weather in one place, it has a profound effect around the planet. In fact, there's a principle in physics, and it's basically the butterfly effect, which is an old theory that goes, if a butterfly is flapping its wings in one part of the planet, it can create a hurricane in another. And the way this was done, figured out, was somebody made a very, very slight mathematical error in a computation. And as they compounded out the computation, it had a geometric effect. In other words, a small amount of energy at one point created a huge change in the outcome on the other. And this is how this was discovered, and then it's been proven in a number of laboratory settings that this theory, the butterfly effect, is actually quite real. The point is, what we know about weather modification, we can go back a little bit in history. In 1977, the United States, the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, and 60 other countries signed a treaty where we agreed not to use weather modification as a weapon of war. Now, that's a long time ago. Now, anyone who watched CNN today, and it's April in 2000, saw that we're just now seeing the the Russians signing off on START 2, one of the disarmament treaties for nuclear weapons. A few years ago, we remember hearing about the sign-off on the chemical and biological. Yet 23 years ago, we signed off on geophysical manipulation and weather modification, because that's where the technology was then. It had advanced to the point where countries realized that if we move forward in this area, we would have serious, serious consequences. One of the other things that came up with weather modification generally, there's a couple of things. I'll read a very short quote, and this kind of puts it in perspective. This is from Secretary of Defense William Cohen, who's our current Secretary of Defense, and he made this quote in April 1997 at the University of Georgia, and I quote, "Others are engaging even in an eco-type of terrorism whereby they can alter climate, set off earthquakes and volcanoes remotely through the use of electromagnetic waves," unquote. Now that's our current Secretary of Defense commenting on the state of the technology. And he's commenting on three areas: climate, earthquakes, and volcanoes using an electromagnetic system. In other words, not cloud seeding, not chemicals, not blasts causing faults to go, but electromagnetic waves. And he's accrediting terrorist organizations with this capability. Now, in the context of our latest book, Earthrising, the Revolution, we document very carefully. There's over 650 source documents that were quoted here, and each of them are footnoted. So when I make a statement, you can look at where it came from on the same page as it's written, and you can see where it came from. And most of our material is either U.S. patents, military records, academic studies, or mainstream media reports. And this material was derived from 80 boxes of archival material, reduced to 12, reduced to the 650 best sources to lay out our case. And when you think of weather mod, and you think about the fact that we're really just starting to gain an understanding of how these systems interact, and what they're finding is that underlying all these systems ultimately is energy. And as we talk tonight, we're going to be talking a lot about energy in terms of how it affects both human health and hardware or machinery. And when we think about physical matter, you can think about it in these terms: energy, atoms, molecules, chemicals and compounds, and eventually the physical manifestation, physical form. And that's pretty much the way it rolls. And what we're talking about is things that affect it at an energetic level, that have a roll-up effect through all living systems and non-living systems in terms of their composition and effect. What we're also finding is the interest in changing geophysical outcomes, in other words, what's happening in the planet naturally, by man-made means. And I really want to read a couple of verses that I think are relevant to put some of this into perspective. And I think it's important to put this in perspective. And I want to first go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 through 27. "And God said, Let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them."
Well, we've run out of time today. I'm going to have to interrupt right there, but I encourage you to get these two DVDs to understand about these storms like Harvey and Irma and how scalar wave very well could be hitting us. In other words, this could be the Russians, via the hand of God, hitting America. The first one, Russia's Secret Weapons to Defeat America by Bill Sniblin, defines how scalar wave works. Weapons of the New World Order explains how it works from a military standpoint to be able to knock out missiles, attacking airplanes, basically to defeat the mutually assured destruction that Russia and America has operated on since World War II. Each DVD valued at $30. We're making both of them available this week for a gift of just $30 in the Scalar Wave gift offer. ProphecyClub.com or 785-266-1112. The Scalar Wave gift offer, 785-266-1112 or ProphecyClub.com. Now from the Prophecy Club, some exciting opportunities for you. I'm the next speaker at the Prophecy Club. I memorized the book of Revelation, and in the process, God gave me 12 awesome revelations. Jesus is not the primary message of Revelation. What is? My biggest revelation, what is the morning star? Who are the two witnesses? The final answer to the rapture question. Definitive proof that America is in Revelation. And what is America's future? 7 signs to spot the Antichrist early. When does the New Jerusalem arrive? Are there 1 or 2 judgments? The surprising final plague on earth. October 14th and 15th, Saturday evening, 7 p.m., Sunday morning, 9 a.m. at the Prophecy Club, 2540 K Avenue in Plano. That's October 14 and 15, Saturday evening, 7 p.m., Sunday morning, 9 a.m., Spirit of Prophecy Church, corner of Park and K in Plano. No charge. It's on Revelations on Revelation. See you there. Order your copy of the DVD at prophecyclub.com.